Hello everyone. Bonjour, salut tout le monde, bienvenue. I'm John Peters. I'm the professor and director of Master Employment Relations here at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland. For those who don't know, St. John's is a little island, and Newfoundland is a little island out in the North Atlantic. And while many of you are enjoying your good weather, we're looking at 15 centimeters of snow today. So you can have a beer on me where you're enjoying yourself. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's CRIMT webinar, The Turbulent Times for Steelworkers and Their Unions, Comparative Perspectives for Forging a Just Transition. And I'm happy to have us joined today with Meg Gingrich, Alistair McDermott, and Alexander Souza. So this is just one in a series of CRIMT webinars that addresses topics such as the climate crisis and the future of work, how unions can engage in climate action and win green jobs, as well as the benefits of securing just transition. And regarding today's webinar, I think it's really important that we do discuss about what's happening in the global steel industry as it's facing a period of extreme turbulence, tariff policies everywhere, disrupting markets and prompting a rethink of the need for industrial policies. The armed conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine are disrupting supply chains and energy prices, as well as the prospects for long-term economic growth. And yet the steel industry itself is a major source of carbon emissions, accounting for approximately 7 to 9% of emissions around the world. And so decarbonizing steel through capital investments in new green technologies, such as hydrogen-based direct reduced iron or electric arc furnaces, is critically important. However, such investments are often delayed and often used by corporations to cut capacity, and usually with dire consequences for workers in many of their communities. So what we want to discuss today is what are the political and economic challenges do industrial unions face in the steel industry today? Who's going to be bearing the costs and who might be able to reap the benefits of this necessary transition? And what can workers and their unions and their communities do to address many of these challenges in these turbulent times? So before we get started, I just want to note very quickly for everyone that's online that we have simultaneous translation for the webinar, both in audio and in transcript. So just please click on your interpretation button on your menu bar and choose your preferred language. So pour la traduction, cliquez sur le bouton plus d'options et puis interprétation dans votre barre et du menu et choisis la langue. And as a last quick note, I just want to note that Jonas Algers from the Katalys Institute of Stockholm will not be able to join us today, sadly, because of a family matter. So to start our webinar off, I'd like to introduce our three panelists. Meg Gingrich is the Assistant to the National Director of the United Steelworkers Canadian National Office. She's the Senior Administrative and Policy Advisor to the USW in Canada, with lead responsibilities for issues related to trade, industrial policy, and the clean economy. And she also serves as the president of Blue Green Canada, which brings together labor environmental groups to advocate for clean, sustainable jobs, as well as better industrial policy across Canada. So, Meg, we usually like to start our webinars with sort of quick takeaways. So I was wondering, you're currently, I understand, at the National USW Stand Up for Steel Conference. So if you can just give us 1 minute, what are the key issues being discussed at the conference today, and what are some of the immediate solutions that you're trying to put forward?
Thanks, John. Thanks for the introduction, and hello to everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. So we're here in Ottawa, Canada's capital, lobbying the government with dozens of steelworkers from across the country. And our main issues, some are sort of a reaction to measures that we need to stabilize the steel industry and to protect workers in the face of the trade war, tariffs imposed by the United States on Canadian steel, but also to develop a vision of the steel industry in Canada. So really looking for pressing for government to also develop a clear steel industrial strategy to involve workers in discussions about steel and the future of steel. And that includes coherence in terms of policy around climate goals with, climate and decarbonization. With the expansion and development of the domestic steel industry. So it's sort of on the one hand, trade measures that we're asking for, worker protections, but then also a grander vision of what the steel industry of Canada could look like going forward.
Good. Thanks so much, Meg. Alistair McDermott. Alistair is the Assistant General Secretary and Operations Director at the UK Trade Union Community. Alistair's been with the union since 2004, and he leads the work in the steel sector and serves as a spokesperson on issues such as British steel developments as well as the steel industry's future. So, Alistair, a quick takeaway for you in 1 minute. What's the core takeaway from community's recent experience about navigating steel bankruptcies, closures, and perhaps the transition, and perhaps a better transition at Port Talbot? 1 minute.
Well, 1 minute, that's quite a question to answer in 1 minute. I suppose in terms of key messages, get stuck into the difficult conversations early. Our experience is if you're not around the table, you're on the table. And wherever you are, if you're a steel worker and your business or industry is still to decarbonize and change is coming and it's going to be tough. And our recent and quite bitter experience actually is you need to get involved at an early stage before the technology choices are made and the timeline for those technology choices, because to a very great extent, those technology choices define the transition. And if there are inbuilt cliff edges within those technology choices, it's very, very difficult, even with the best will in the world, to secure a just transition for your members. So, getting involved and trying to shape those technology choices is absolutely essential.
Great. Thanks so much, Alistair. And we're going to come back to about those difficult conversations and getting involved later. Alexander Souza is a research officer with EF Metall, Sweden's largest industrial workers union. He's been there since 2005, and he works on industrial policy, sectoral and strategic company issues, as well as on the steel and metal industries. And he currently sits on the board of directors for the fourth Swedish National Pension Fund. Alexander, you got 1 minute too. So, given recent developments in Sweden, what's your sense, and what's perhaps would you be able to give a sense of hope for industrial labor unions elsewhere in Europe and North America about the Swedish experience? How can moving to green steel with zero emissions actually also preserve good unionized jobs?
We think that the green transition is really good for our members because they lead to new investments. I mean, looking at our old steel companies, we've had seen a lack of investments for many years, and many of them are really old. So these kind of investments in the green transition is also investments in new production facilities. And we've seen a little bit of headwinds, or quite a lot of headwinds regarding the green transition in Europe as well, and in Sweden. But we're fortunate that our companies have kept on pushing the green transition and want to do the investment still. So we see a big new steel mill being built up in the north of Sweden, Stegra. They had some financing issues. Fortunately, that was solved last week, and they are pushing ahead, and now will probably start production late 2027, which is really good. We were really fearing that that would be a bankruptcy, like in Northvolt, the battery factory that is now up and running again. SSAB, our biggest steel company, is keeping their promises to invest in a new steel mill, in fully integrated steel mill in Luleå, which is an investment of 50 billion SEK. They are transforming their site in Oxelösund, which is a investment around about 6 billion SEK. So hopefully we will be fossil free in Sweden by 2030 if everything goes according to plan. And these plans are still there. We have some problems with permitting, and things take a little bit longer to get the energy in place and so on. The only place where we are a little bit shaky is on the DRI side. We don't see LKAB building the DRIs they've said that they will build in Gällivare. They are put on hold. So we'll see what happens there. But hopefully they will be online soon as well. So I'll stop there.
So there are good news, but there's also the bad news. And I'm wondering if we'd be able to talk about both the bad news, getting involved in
Sure.
those difficult conversations, but also about how we might get to some of the good news in terms of the steel industry. So to start our roundtable discussion, maybe I'll start with you, Meg. I mean, the steel and metal industry workers are being hit, I think, on all sides, certainly in both U.S. as well as in Canada. We have the tariffs, we have layoffs, we have firms like Algoma taking millions in government subsidies to build a new electric arc furnace, and then they go out and they shed, roughly 1,000 jobs. And meanwhile, we have ArcelorMittal saying that we're going to take public money and then and move to renewable energy as well as and try to improve the sort of process, and then sort of walk away from it entirely and continue to emit megatons of CO2 while ignoring the climate crisis. So I'm wondering, what's your sense? I mean, USW has always had to, fight, big corporations here in North America. Is this just a case of another classic case of sort of corporate power, and it's driven by financial interests and global supply chains, and it's simply just looking for another opportunity to leverage the transition to downsize the workforce? And if so, then what sort of responses do the USW see about trying to deal with those kinds of, power issues and deal with those kinds of difficult conversations that Alistair has mentioned before?
Yeah, thank you. So this is true that with the Algoma case, with the transition to the electric arc furnace there, the company got a lot of money to do this and completely bungled it in terms of dealing with the union and the members there. And so to answer your question, I mean, I'm sure that part of it is just classic, corporations that are trying to reduce labor costs, and this is one way that they can do it. Some of it is, there was a need for new investment. I think, if we had stuck with the old ways in blast furnace, they need maintenance, they were getting old. And so there was, there's some positives in terms of sort of the longevity of the steel industry in a place like Sault Ste. Marie in Ontario. And so there, I think that there could be some good to come from it in terms of thinking about continued steel production in that community, and the green transition can provide those opportunities. But the way that it's been done here largely is sort of without consulting with the union in a way that should happen or should have happened. And the Algoma case is a prime example of this, where the union wasn't even aware that this money was coming. It kind of came as a surprise announcement. Um, there was no, and so this kind of goes back to what Alistair was just saying, where, ideally, if you want this to work and to have the political support from unions and from workers on any of this transition, then you need to have them there. We need to be there early on, as early as possible. We have collective agreements. We have, a history of negotiating around technological change and so on. And so, sort of using those agreements at the plant level, that's extremely important to try to reduce the number of layoffs, if possible, provide other training opportunities. But then, of course, beyond just the sort of local level, looking at larger policy level, that if we're making these investments into transition, that it is tied to a larger industrial strategy. And so that we're making sure that there are, that jobs are put front and center in terms of those plans. And that if there is job loss, that we have other options, other alternatives, training opportunities, and so on, where we can tie people to other similar employment, so we're not losing all these jobs in these communities that are generally pretty dependent on their steel industries. So there's a lot going on in that, and I think certainly the way that it's been done in Canada has not been great. And I will just reemphasize the point of ensuring, like, we have to fight to be there often, for our voices to be heard and to get better material outcomes from these types of things, and we'll continue to do that. But if there's anyone listening who has any power, you're going to lose support of workers, lose support from unions if you don't do that. And we see that a lot in Canada, where and probably around the world, where there's sort of what we would call a green lash, or sort of political opposition or political rallying around transition. And so that's something that's important as well, and why we need to be involved as much as possible.
Thanks, Meg. And Alistair, it seems to me that there are sort of a number of parallels between Canada and the UK in terms of what corporations are doing. I mean, Tata Steel has closed its blast furnaces at Port Talbot. It negotiated with the government for a while and just went ahead and did whatever it wanted. And then it has promised now to build an EAF, although again, not with a lot of consultation, I understand, with your union. And then it's shed, thousands of jobs. And at the same time now, the government has kept British Steel working after the Jingy Group just threatened to simply walk away. And it doesn't sound like there's been any resolution for that. So in some sense, again, it's about corporate power, and you're getting deindustrialization by decarbonization and job loss in one case, and then you're getting deindustrialization and job loss simply by default in the other. So I'm wondering if you could give us a bit of a background about how the British steel industry and the British steel workers have ended up in such dire straits, and I also know if you could then tell us a little bit about some of the community response and the community union response in drafting up, new industrial plans for very different paths, and you could tell us a little bit about those plans and about those conversations that you've been having about trying to make sure that Britain retains its steel industry, but it also retains a sustainable steel industry with good jobs.
Yep, no problem. Thanks for the questions, John. Lots and lots of parallels in our experience with the picture that was just outlined by Meg. Certainly, our view is all industrial transitions, successful industrial transitions, can only be delivered through consensus. That's what all the research shows. We did a research project with the Prospect Union in the UK a couple of years ago, comparing the UK's pretty terrible track record managing industrial transitions with best practice elsewhere. And the cases we looked at, such as SSAB in Sweden and Voestalpine in Austria, common to that is always a real sense of partnership working, tripartite working, government, companies and workers all sitting around the table. We've had a very difficult few decades really in the steel industry. We're extremely used to managing restructurings. We've done that very well, I think. Our track record has been very good in terms of looking after people, and we have good industrial relations generally in the steel industry, in large part because my union represents mainly the blue collar production workers, who are those who stand to lose their jobs in any big restructuring relating to decarbonisation. And we have about 90% of the workforce in membership. So by and large, the companies have to listen to us when we say something. But when the companies are left to their own devices, they look after themselves, don't they, at the end of the day? And the politicians, in our view, need to take a far greater role in terms of holding them to account and putting strings or more strings attached to the financial contributions that they're making for some of these huge decarbonisation investments. So the experience of Port Talbot, I think, is a very good example in some ways of how not to do things and how to, I suppose, snatch defeat from the jaws of victory to a certain extent, because it was going well and then it wasn't. So in 2020, we first got wind of Tata having plans to shut the two blast furnaces in Port Talbot and replace them with two electric arc furnaces. We weren't very happy about that, but it led to a lengthy dialogue, very open, constructive dialogue, where Tata paid for the unions to bring in our own independent consultants, a whole team of them, and work within the company with the company's experts, with the company's finance department, commercial experts, and so on, to really sort of lift the bonnet and have a look at all of the different potential restructuring strategies that Tata had looked at, and for us to come up with our own ideas as well and try and shape the company's proposals. And we were making a lot of progress actually, and we were sort of getting towards a consensus position which we could have lived with. And then COVID happened, and then war in Ukraine happened, and all of this went sort of off the table into the long grass. In that time, prices increased, doubled in some cases, and the costs of these transition plans just became of a completely different order of magnitude. We had firm commitments from the company, from the Indian owners, Tata, who are based in Mumbai, we went over many times to talk to, that they would return to the table and have a full consultation on all the options once they'd sort of reassessed the position. And then in September 2023, they announced, stood alongside the business secretary, Kemi Badenoch, who's now the leader of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, that they'd done a deal and they had a plan, and it was going to be to shut the blast furnaces in Port Talbot and replace them with a big electric arc furnace. No transition, shut them down, and while they're building the electric arc furnace, the strategy would be essentially to import dirty steels from blast furnaces in India to feed the mills in the UK and make a ton of money doing that before CBAM, our carbon border adjustment mechanism, came in and made it financially prohibitive for them to do so. So, the irony of that is not lost on anyone. Shutting our blast furnaces down in the name of decarbonisation to build an electric arc furnace, but shipping dirty steels halfway across the world to feed the mills in the meantime and make 3,000 of our members redundant. So obviously that was unacceptable to us. Potential, on the verge of an industrial dispute for many, many months. We did do some very in-depth consultations since that announcement was made in September 2023, but ultimately it wasn't possible to materially change the proposals. There were some changes. We saved a few hundred jobs by persuading the company to keep the hot strip mill in Port Talbot running through the transition period. So they weren't just importing coils to roll in the mills, they were importing slab, which would then be rolled in the hot strip mill in Port Talbot. But it's very, very difficult to make material changes once the direction of travel had been sort of nailed down between the government and the company. And what was really frustrating to us was so many warm words, so many consultations, so many high-level meetings with government, right to the top of government, and everyone says, "Oh, we need a steel industry, and we want to be green, and we want to grow, and we want to be able to do this, that, and the other, and supply our military, and so on." But ultimately, when it came to the crunch, it's all pounds, shillings, and pence. They went for the cheapest, easiest option. The unions were advocating a solution which was more gradual, more phased. We'd have kept one blast furnace going while we shut the other and put in the first blast furnace, and then the other would have kept going into the 2030s, and we'd have shut that down at the point we have a DRI facility in. And with that slightly longer term time scale, we could have managed the social impacts and made sure we avoided compulsory redundancies. It would have been much less risky, and we'd have kept our ability to make steel out of raw materials. But it was expensive. There was an element of risk. There's lots of unproven technologies flying about around the green steel making agenda, and so ultimately it just came down to cost and what was easiest and quickest to do, and it was our members who paid the price for that. So very, very disappointing, and really the responsibility for that obviously lies at the employer's door. But the politicians, the government, the last government, Conservative government at the time, things have changed now. We've got a Labour government, I'm glad to say, really sort of enabled that to happen. And when Labour came in, it was already so far down the line, it was essentially impossible to roll back. So very disappointing. It was a case of it was going in the right direction, but ultimately it came down to what was in the best interests of the company as they saw it, and our members have been losing their jobs. So we lost 2,500 jobs in 2004. They are building this 3 million ton electric arc furnace as we speak, but the steel industry is not what it was. We can make less. There's less opportunities. There's thousands of less people employed in the business. But we have to be positive about the future. We know we have a fantastically valuable steel market. We have world-class skills, fantastic universities, and with the work that we've been doing around the steel strategy and industrial strategy, the government's just published and rolled out a new steel strategy with action on energy prices, procurement, business rates, skills, £2.5 billion to invest in green steel making. We have much more of a chance, because the biggest issue for us has been we're not competitive in the UK in terms of our structural policy environment. In particular, our energy prices have been more or less twice as much as our French and German competitors pay, and that's been very difficult to sort of work within those parameters, because companies do what is in their interest, and if they think they can make money, they will invest. But that's not been the case in recent decades. So hopefully we've made some inroads in terms of putting that competitive policy landscape in place for the future.
Let me come back to that, Alistair, right? And we'll
Yeah.
talk about more about the policies. And because I do want to contrast that experience where you've had conversations and then the Tata just went ahead and did whatever it wanted, similar to Algoma just went ahead and did whatever it wanted. But that's not been the situation at all in Sweden, Alexander. And much to my surprise, SSAB has actually been quite willing to listen to both government and to EF Metal. And you've been directly involved in many of these discussions. And interestingly enough, SSAB hasn't walked away, and the state-owned mining company, LKAB, as well as the public energy utility, Vattenfall, have all been involved in these negotiations to try and move a green steel project and a green iron project forward. So this, to me, was completely surprising when you told me all about this. And I'm wondering if you could just give us a bit of a background about how that sort of came together and what was the role of EF Metal in some of those negotiations in both making that transition happen, but also making sure that jobs are protected and that the training would also be there for EF Metal members.
Sure. I mean, it's a little bit of a different trajectory than in Canada and Britain. I mean, hybrid, as the collaboration is called, started, I think, in 2016, 17, in the head of the then R&D, head of R&D of SSAB, Martin Pei, when he looked at the coming legislation and looked at, you know, what ETS would cost, and if you when you don't have any free allowances, they said that we can't make brown steel anymore. We have to change the process. And then he looked at different processes, and then they've looked at this kind of DRI with hydrogen. And then they made a consortium with Vattenfall, our big public utility, and LKAB, which supplies the pellets to SSAB. They have a direct line between Gällivare and Luleå, where we have the blast furnace. So it started like an idea when they dipped their toes in seeing, is this possible? Then they got some state money, but it was a small amount. It was like a catalyst. So they started to look at it. And the more they looked into the technology, they found that this is probably possible. They were laughed at that in the industry back then. I remember going to meetings in the EU, and everybody said that's not, you know, going to happen. But they got more and more confident, and then you got the whole green movement. And they started investment, and it actually board of directors, where we have guys, said yes to keep on pushing this project forward and actually doing a demo DRI in Luleå. And we were really pushing for this because we saw this as a possibility to reinvent the company. But it was a long process in the board of directors and a long process to get this to really happen, to go from words to actually investing. And in the beginning, it's a small investment, and also there the state came in with a little bit of money. So it's a research facility. And then they research more and more into the technology and see that they can make advanced steel also with this kind of technology. Because there was a debate if you need, iron ore, to go for iron ore to make the really specialized products. And then they became going from a company that was seen as not so hip to becoming one of the superstars in the green transformation. They went to the UN and things like that, and the company got self-confidence and looked more and more into that this is possible, and took the decision then years later to, after they built the pilot plant where they actually have made fossil-free steel. And I think they're one of the few that can go fully fossil-free with the technology that they have in the future. So they've actually sold products that gave them the confidence to take the plans forward, and also to get I'm going to make a long story short, but at the end they took the decision to invest in Luleå, which is 5 billion euros in a fully integrated steel mill. And that is now underway. Now we have some problems with some problems with the preparing of the ground, but hopefully that will be solved. And they hope to be finished by 2029. Now the mood is different because everybody's challenging, is this profitable? Because it's a huge investment, the steel prices are low, but SSAB is still confident that they can make it happen and that it will be profitable. The only thing where we still don't see a final decision is to build the DRIs in Gällivare by LKAB. That has been pushed forward, probably because it's hard to make the hydrogen and get the energy there, but there's also probably a profitability issue, and they are focusing more on their mining part yet now, because they have to dig up more things from the ground. But hopefully that will, come on board again. And what is good, and they are transforming the site in Oxelösund even earlier, they are shutting down the blast furnaces and building an electric arc furnace, and they will use their rolling facilities as they have now. It will cost some jobs, but we can handle that, and also in Luleå. So they are investing in their existing footprint, and we have been on board on this. We have used EU funding to do training up in Luleå, because these guys will go from working in a blast furnace to a rolling mill, an electrical arc furnace. So it's different jobs. So we've already started this. We have a project. And what is also good by SSAB, that they have a third mill in Borlänge, where they have rolling mills, but they have kept investing there as well in their current footprint, because they will lose some production to Luleå. But we're also handing it there that we won't see huge job losses. It could be quite manageable. So the company has really behaved in a good manner. We have been in constant dialogue. We've even been pushing for this, because we see the need for new mills if we want to compete in the future. So this has been a really good collaboration with the company. The state has only been a catalyst. They haven't put much money into it. They've even worked against Stegra in the last couple of years regarding state funding, and made it harder for Stegra to get money, which should be more or less criminal, but that is a different story. But it's been mostly the company who has been driving this transformation, not the government as much. The former government was much more green, and we had, and it was the policy that made the SSAB to make the calculation that this is a good investment, because the old facilities were so old that it needed new investments anyways. And now they will have super modern technology, which they can make even more specialized steel.
And Sasa, could you just tell us a little bit, just to clarify? So you're negotiating, EF Metal was in negotiations and consultations with SSAB a lot, but could you also tell us then about the mining portion, or about the energy portion with either Vattenfall or LKAB? Was EF Metal also in negotiations with those companies as well about how that transition would happen, or the kinds of necessary energy, or the kinds of iron that would be required, or how that new DRI process would be required? Was there negotiations with EF Metal and those companies as well?
It doesn't really work like that in Sweden, that we negotiate with the government or with the public utility company. What we do then is lobby. We have been lobbying the governments that we need more energy supply and we need the grids to work. And then we've also been involved in some kinds of lobbying when it comes to specials, that you get energy to where it needs to be. For instance, we had a problem that at one point, because of the way you get energy, you have to stand in a queue, and you don't know who's ahead of you in the queue. So we could have waited for years to get the energy to Luleå, so SSAB could start the new integrated steel mill. then Vattenfall did something that made it happen, so they got the energy, which is so there has been lobbying, but we're not in direct negotiations. It's more lobbying and pushing the government to help them out in the way they can. But it hasn't. But because we were so early out, it wasn't huge amounts of money. It's not the subsidies you see nowadays or you saw on the continent here in Europe. When it comes to SSAB, it was our local guys who sit on the board of directors and who negotiate with the company on a daily basis. Then we have a dialogue with the SSAB. I mean, our president talks to the CEO. They meet regularly. I talk to people who work at SSAB, how we can collaborate. We also work with the employers where we collaborate on issues where we feel that we need a policy change when it comes to permitting, energy supply. So it's more of a lobbying effort than that we actually negotiate. We don't have those kind of close collaborations or the way that you actually deal with the government regarding things like you seem to do in the UK or in Canada. We are not. It's more of a. Then sometimes it's easier, and sometimes it's harder to get the government to listen to us. I mean, if we would have a social democratic led government, it would be easier. When we now have a conservative government that doesn't want to do industrial policy, so it's. I hope that was clear.
Good. Well, thanks so much, Sasa. I really appreciate it. So, but it really is a bit of a power dynamic about what you can get the governments or businesses to actually do, right? I mean, that it's not just a technological issue that you can just simply adapt EAFs or new hydrogen technology and increase electricity, but it's actually about a power struggle about trying to make the companies listen and trying to get the governments to act. I guess that's kind of my sense, at least as an outsider. And I know in Canada, Meg, the USW has always had very proactive industrial policies, whether that's a carbon border adjustment mechanism that's been poured or new kinds of procurement rules, which have been pushed now since the tariffs, as well as some job guarantees to transition subsidies. But I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the USW Canada experience about trying to lobby and talk with government. Sometimes they're certainly open, I think, as Sasa has just mentioned, but actually getting them to act is a whole another sort of issue. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that experience, but also about how you've also tried to sort of widen the discussion, either with the Blue-Green Canada Alliance or with others trying to, and other industrial unions trying to get the governments to sort of force their hand and try to act.
Yeah, so I mean, we've long lobbied for and advocated for industrial policies and beyond sort of the specific policies, a larger industrial strategy for Canada. It is difficult. I mean, I will say just the size of Canada, the strong sub-federal jurisdictions make it really difficult to have sort of an overarching industrial strategy for like Canada as a whole. But we've continued to advocate for a strong domestic steel industry, strong industrial strategy. You mentioned some of the specific policies that we've tried for, and with the trade war, the imposition of tariffs by the United States on Canada, as bad as that was, I think it did force the government, both the federal government and also provincial governments, to really listen to the steelworkers and other industrial unions, and also better understand the importance of having a strong industrial economy, both for good jobs and things like that, but also just for our sovereignty, as we get there's territorial threats from the U.S. that we've seen, and we had been become increasingly integrated with the United States over many decades, and at this point, I think that sort of as bad as all of this is, it did allow us an opportunity to really get in there and articulate a vision of the steel industry in Canada and start talking about areas where we've lost capacity. We talk about sort of developing an industrial strategy, bolstering our industrial economy, having these big infrastructure projects in Canada where we use domestic steel. And these are all things that we push for, but then, half the things that we would want, we don't even produce in Canada anymore, structural steel, rail, things like that. And so, those are some of the things that we've been really highlighting with the federal government in particular, is that we can't just have these piecemeal policies. Yes, we have a price on carbon. We want a carbon border adjustment. to sort of prevent carbon leakage and all of that. But we also need to create demand in our domestic markets. We need to make sure that there's the ability for private capital to invest in Canada, that it's actually stable enough that there will be long-term demand, those types of things. And so we've certainly in the last year or so made some advancements on procurement, on worker supports, things like that. We're still lacking an overall vision, I would say, for Canada. But the access to key politicians and things like that they want to hear from us, and they say the right things, but we'll need to hold their feet to the fire because they can say all the wonderful things that they want when they meet with us, but if they're not actually enacting the policies, and if they still kind of undermine these goals of having a strong industrial economy by signing more trade deals that allow cheap access or tariff-free access to our markets, that undercut our domestic steel industry, things like that. So we need to make sure that there's coherence in our trade policies, protecting our domestic market, actually creating markets and so on. And we're seeing progress, but you know, ultimately, in a lot of cases, what we see is that still, even when there's public projects, they want to go for the cheapest steel possible. They claim to want to, buy domestic and build up Canadian jobs and things like that. But when it comes down to it, we don't always see that happening. And so that's something that our union will continue to fight for, continue to point out, and continue to push for. And so at least we're seeing some progress, but we need to do a lot more, and we need to have that overall sort of our overarching industrial strategy.
Great. Thanks so much, Megan. Alistair, I think that's certainly what I've seen from community is to develop that sort of overarching industrial strategy. And it's not just industrial strategy, but it's also about an energy strategy, as well as a hydrogen strategy, as well as about a domestic market strategy from you. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that plan came together, and what has been some of the response then from the Labour government about trying to sort of move forward on that. Because, of course, it's not only involved in some cases nationalization. I believe this is what your union has been calling for, or at least some aspect of that. But also about moving forward in terms of real public procurement strategies with jobs that are attached to it. Could you tell us a little bit about some of that comprehensive plan that you have been involved in developing?
Yes, certainly. So, as I said before, it's been a case of lurching to crisis, from crisis to crisis in the UK for many, many years. And there's a big gap, as Meg says, between what politicians say and the warm words they give for the steel industry and steel workers and so on, and what is actually delivered. And for many, many years, we've been talking about the problems. Things first, things came to head in 2015 when we lost 5,000 jobs in the space of 2 weeks when the SSI Steelworks in Redcar went insolvent. And at the time, the Conservative government set up a Steel Council, which remains in place till this day. And the purpose of that Steel Council is to tackle the challenges facing the industry. Senior union representatives, government representatives, politicians from all parties, and civil servants and experts have played a part in that. But what's so disappointing from our perspective is the challenges then are the challenges now. So we all defined what the big issues were for us at the time, and they were energy prices, procurement policy, business rates, trade defence, support for decarbonisation investments, and they remain the big challenges for us. And so everyone knows what the problems are. We just got to be able to fix them. And we went through so many processes since that time, and really it all came to nothing because all these things cost money ultimately, and successive Conservative secretaries of state in particular just pushed these things down the road. And we ended up more in a sort of firefighting mentality, whereas, when one company's got a problem, we try and prop them up for a bit, or we, get them out of insolvency and give them to someone else and so on. But the fundamental structural challenges have never been addressed. That's changed to a great extent since we've got this Labour government a couple of years ago, and they've really made steel the cornerstone of their industrial policy. And I think it's true to say that steel has had more focus, more attention, and more sort of resource attached to it than probably any other sector. And we've got a government now which is prepared to intervene and make decisions which other governments probably wouldn't make. And the two big examples of that happened last year. So the first relates to Liberty Steel, which is our third biggest steelmaker in the UK, an electric arc furnace-based steelmaker, previously owned by Sanjeev Gupta, who might be a name familiar to someone on this call. He's I think fair to say more than a controversial figure who's bought assets up the world over, leveraged them with debt, and not really invested in them, and ultimately most of them have fallen over at some point. And this business went into insolvency, but the government intervened to support the insolvency, to enable the official receiver to run the business essentially at a loss, paid for by the government, and run a sales process to try and find a home for the business and a sustainable future for the assets, and to protect jobs. And that's still underway. We expect that process to conclude in the next couple of months. But that's been a massive industrial intervention from the government. And the other massive intervention is at British Steel. Now, we talk about what we can make the government do and not, but a lot of that is about kind of, I suppose, winning hearts and minds and campaigning, which is something I think all unions are very good at doing. Steel is a highly political industry, and whether you're in the green lobby or you're interested in national security or regional industrial policy, there's lots and lots of different stakeholders that can be brought together to support an ambitious future for the steel industry. And we're always positive about the steel industry, and we've been running a campaign for the last few years, Britain We Need Our Steel, which is making the positive case for why we and any other country needs the steel industry. And we've had professional footballers having videos explaining why they think we need a steel industry, and musicians and actors and all sorts, and trying to build this consensus that steel is too important. We have to find a solution for it. And I think that was really well demonstrated in the case of British Steel, because the Chinese owners, a company called Jingyi, have owned the business since 2019. It's the first entry into the European steel market by any Chinese owner. It was very controversial, and I think a lot of people's fears came to be realised, really, because there was always a suspicion that they'd be quite happy actually to run down the blast furnaces, to run down the steelmaking side, and keep the rolling assets and feed those rolling assets from steel semi-finished products made in China and shipped over to the mills and rolled in the UK and sold on to the European and US markets. And last year, about a year ago, actually, it became clear that they were actually deliberately starving the furnaces of raw materials. They were trying to sabotage them, to close them. And so the British government took really quite a historic action, and they recalled Parliament to sit on a Saturday for the first time since the Falklands War in the 1980s to debate emergency legislation to take control of the business out of the hands of the Chinese, to stop them destroying it. And it was absolutely urgent, because it was a matter of days before that happened. And I was actually sat in Parliament for that debate with the MPs, and I've never seen anything like it, because you had the Labour government, of course, but also the Conservative MPs, the Green MPs, the Liberal MPs, the Nationalists, all saying the same thing, which is that we have to do this. This is too important to fail. The country needs this steel industry. We need to keep our primary steelmaking capability. And, that is to a great extent because we've been so successful in making the arguments, I think, that it's crucial that the country keeps this capacity in place. So the government intervened then, and they still have control of the company. There's some tension there, because while the government controls the business, it's still owned by Jingyi. So we're advocating for, and we hope that the government will, in the not too distant future, bring forward new legislation or use the powers it already has to nationalize the business and take it out of the hands of the Chinese, because only then can we really secure the future and develop a long-term strategy that we can all buy into. I'll perhaps leave it there. I've got other things to say about the industrial strategy piece, but I'm conscious I've been talking for quite a long time, so I'll pass on.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Alistair. No, I think that's a really good background to sort of understand about sort of the crises as well as the major challenges that unions face, whether it's bankruptcy, whether it's private equity, and the distress nature of of asset utilization, right, as well as layoffs and how that's sort of going forward, but also the need for a really comprehensive plan so that you can actually move in this critical industry forward as well as protect the jobs. I'm also wary of time here, so I do want to thank. So, in terms of this sort of general discussion with you, I want to just move on to the second part of our webinar. And here I'd like to draw on the expertise of a couple of other leading academics and researchers who have been long engaged with the political economy of decarbonization and industrial relations. So now I'd like to call on Dean Stroud from Cardiff University, who's an expert in the steel industry and its workforce, and is the co-editor and a contributor to a new book entitled Industry 4.0 and the Road to Sustainable Steelmaking in Europe. It's been recently published in 2024. And for anyone who's interested in the steel industry and its future, I highly recommend taking a look at the book. So I'm wondering if Dean, if you wanted to share your thoughts as well as any questions you might have for our panelists this morning and this afternoon.
Hi, hi, Alistair. Hi, no, Alistair. Hi.
You doing, Dean?
Actually, I saw Daniel Tech, who I used to work with on a project a long time ago. So it's nice to see some old faces here. I guess I'd like to start with some questions, really, if that's okay, John.
Yes, yeah, go ahead, Dean, please.
Because some of what particularly Alistair was have been saying and Meg was quite interesting to me, as well as, of course, what Alexander was saying. But I guess what struck me is about power resource. And so, for example, Alistair, you're talking about the decisions that were made with regard to Port Talbot under a Conservative government, how things have turned a corner under a Labour government. So there's a support for the steel industry, and that's clear. First of all, I wonder if the decisions that have been made now in response to, for example, the potential closure that there was of Scunthorpe and the British Steel plant, if that was going on under a Conservative government, what would have happened, despite the support that you saw in Parliament from Conservative MPs? And it seems to me that it's very much dependent, the success in the UK of unions with regard to the steel industry is the support of the government of the time. And that can be of different persuasions. It seems to be the same also in Sweden to some degree, where we talked about the difference between more social democratic and the more right-wing governments. So if that's the case, how do unions consolidate their power so that they can push the decisions that they want with regard to the steel industry, whatever the government is, of whatever persuasion it is? So if the success of the strategies that you would like to see are dependent on the government at the time, how do you kind of deal with a change of government? Would the British Steel case be the same under a Conservative government? Would a Liberty Steel be the same under a Conservative government? Where are you going to draw your power resource from to make sure that you can have power regardless of the government that is in place?
I think that'd be a question for Alistair, perhaps for Meg as well, in terms of trying to respond. And then we can perhaps just have a quick response from Alexander, which is a very different case where you have, a 70% union density and 90% unionized collective bargaining coverage, right? So as well as co-determination in many of the largest firms. But Alistair, perhaps you wanted to talk a little bit about, how can you build power resources when you're losing members?
Yeah, I'll have a first go at that. I mean, as I said, I think sort of building sort of public consensus as far as you can and continuing to campaign the positive case for the industry in terms of jobs, in terms of economic security, in terms of national security, all of that. Our Britain We Need Our Steel campaign, which you'll be aware of, Dean probably took part in as well. I think that is really important. Do I think that a Conservative government would have done what Labour did in terms of the Special Measures Act and recalling Parliament and taking control of a Chinese company, essentially? No, I don't. I don't think for 1 minute they would have done that. Do I think that a Conservative government wouldn't intervene in support of this deal? Well, the evidence is they will sometimes. When British Steel was last in insolvency in 2019, it was the Conservatives who supported that insolvency and ultimately nationalised effectively the business for a year before it was sold on to the Chinese. There was a particular individual involved then, Greg Clark, who was the Conservative Business Secretary at the time, who was, a fairly sort of industrially active Conservative, I think, as they go. So that was fairly unique circumstances in some ways. But our view, certainly, as you know, Dean, is we will always, my union will always work with whoever is the government at the time. Yes, we're affiliated to the Labour Party, but we will always work with who has the power, whoever has the levers to support our members. And we will always be seeking to build good relationships with governments of whatever stripe, because that's the responsible thing to do. That is the only way you can shape change in the interests of your members. So, that's what I'd say to that question.
Okay.
Meg?
Yeah. Sorry, it just seems to me that I'm wondering what lessons in terms of power resource we might learn. So in Wales, there's a complex kind of governance structure in the UK with the devolved administrations, and Wales has its social procurement. So for those that don't know, Port Talbot that was transitioning to the EAF is in Wales. Wales is a devolved government, which is a Labour government, and which at the time of the closure of the blast furnaces was a Labour government. But the Labour government had real, I think, and I don't know if you would agree with me, Alistair, problems gaining any real leverage at the scale that it needed, despite things such as the Procurement and Social Partnership Act, which is about consultation, which it doesn't seem to, for example, have the kind of level of consultation, the level of social partnership that we might see in Sweden, and that we might see in Germany, for example, where there is perhaps more a deeper level of collective bargaining. Not even as in Germany, not even as much union density as in the UK, but certainly it seems that there is more power resource, to come back to that. And yeah, I just wonder, the situation in Wales, I think, is quite different, but perhaps not that much different if you looked across from the continent. Did you see any kind of real influence from a Labour government in Wales and what they could do when Port Talbot was under threat?
Do you want me to come back on that, John?
If you got 1 minute, Alistair.
Okay,
Sorry,
1 minute. There were particularly problematic dynamics there, Dean, as you know, in terms of all the unions were signed up to one plan, and then one union wasn't after that, and that union was quite influential within Wales, and so that did create a very difficult dynamic in terms of everyone lining up behind one particular course of action. We had a different, we had a Welsh administration, a Labour administration in Wales, and a Conservative administration in Westminster. Westminster held all the cards there because they were the ones with the hundreds of millions of pounds to put into decarbonisation. And we sort of ended up in a position where the Welsh government was sort of almost our lobbying partners rather than sort of decision makers, because they could do bits and pieces on skills and procurement, of course they could, but the big ticket items really only had to be done in that one in Westminster. And I think the politics, and there was some politics sort of played there, made it quite difficult to come to sort of any kind of consensus position between the two. It was a very unusual set of circumstances, as I'm sure you'd agree.
Yeah. Wait, sorry to put you on the spot there, Alistair. But I just
No,
think
no,
it's
that's fine.
for people here to understand that kind of complexity.
Mm.
And I guess it might be the same for Meg with the USW, with the kind of federal states of Canada. That there's those kinds of dynamics that go on in these decisions that are made about plants, and then that and plants closure and decarbonisation processes, and then how that again compares to Alexander's case in Sweden, and about how there's different sets of industrial relations in different places and what that might mean for the outcomes. And we can see it quite starkly, I think, between what's happening in Canada, the UK, compared to places like Sweden and the industrial relations landscape there. I just thought it might be useful to unpick a little bit of that. I don't know if anyone else, Meg or Alexandra, has got anything to comment on those kinds of questions.
I'll comment quickly. I mean, I think I actually, hear a lot of similarities between what Alistair is describing in Canada, even though there's a lot of differences as well. But I do think in terms of how we influence policy and whether, certain governments are friendlier to workers, absolutely. And does it change how we campaign? I mean, we'll have certainly, again, very similar to what Alistair said, we'll have a campaign on steel. We're affiliated with the Social Democratic Party federally in Canada, in English Canada. Um, but we'll work with anyone. And we sort of, you'll shift whether it's more of a sort of defense or national security angle versus, and we'll always keep workers' issues front and center as much as we can, but sort of, or whether it's more of a decarbonization angle, kind of depends on who's in power. And certainly, the fact that Canadian provinces have so much power, and different labor relation systems in each province, different governments. There are some that are friendly to us, some that are not. But if you have an unfriendly sort of federal government, maybe we focus more at the subnational level or, like that type of thing. And so we do shift things around kind of depending on who's in power and can get more or less. But yeah, so it does sound somewhat similar to Alistair, and it's certainly, like I said, difficult to come up with this sort of national overarching industrial strategy where we bring everyone on the same page when if you look at the internal political structure of Canada, it's very difficult to do that, but we use that where we can to we can make progress in British Columbia if we can't in Ontario or whatever. So those types of things, and we shift our strategy there where needed.
And Alexander, I guess there is a huge difference, right? I mean, Sweden not only has, very high union density and collective bargaining coverage, but, it also has co-determination with, unions sitting on many corporate boards, as well as then, there's several sort of social partnership councils, whether that's for energy, for example, or in some cases for training or unemployment insurance. And the unions themselves also have control over the unemployment insurance as well as some of their own pension funds. So I'm wondering if you could tell us about how that really does change the dynamics about any discussion about, decarbonization or job loss or retraining.
I think I mean, Sweden is a little bit different, I think, in this context that steel isn't seen as a special sector that is, where you have behemoths that were state-owned that are, legacy things. So we would never be able to do what Alistair did in the UK. Even if we had a social democratic government, they wouldn't have saved I don't believe that they would have saved a steel mill in that state. And we really don't use politics that hands-on. We have some state aid that we push for, to get things rolling or to help out when there's no real investment case, so the companies continue going. But we don't really do these huge packages, and we've never really had. And then I mean, I don't know if we're good or lucky in this case. I mean, we also had great relations with Stegra. We had a collective agreement with them before we had any members there. And we've been able to talk to them all the time.
That's not the North American experience.
No, we knew the CEO from before. And they've been really open to us, and we've been able to talk to them. We tried to help them. And then we also collaborate quite a lot with the employers, when it comes to policy development. It's in our industrial agreement, which sets the national wage mark, which sets the wages for all of Sweden. In that agreement, we also have an agreement on development, where we should collaborate on the industrial policy to really, get the Swedish industry to innovate and advance. So we don't really have that kind of activist government like sometimes in Britain or in Canada. We don't have those huge, like I've seen some of the state aid packages you have in Canada. Those are like, couldn't even dream of those figures. But so we are pushing for a different part. We push more for R&D support, some industrialization support. Now we probably have to change our view, because so much is happening in the EU right now when it comes to state aid on different levels, that we have to adapt on energy prices. We are lucky because we have a fossil-free energy system, which is cheap comparably to Southern Europe. But if you change the prices on the continent, we'll probably have to follow. So we're in a dangerous spiral right now. And I'm so glad that we don't have the Liberties or the ArcelorMittals, because they don't want to change. And if a company doesn't want to change and just is chasing state aid, that is really dangerous. I've been in those kind of situations in the car sector. We have GM tried to negotiate with. You're only doing concession bargaining. You get the state to invest in one facility, then they want money for another facility, and you just go down this rabbit hole. And it's really destructive for us as unions. So I'm so glad that I don't have to deal with these guys. We had a guy from Liberty call us regarding a aluminium smelter here, and because it's owned by Russians, which isn't good. And I just told them, please don't come to Sweden.
I like that kind of bargaining strategy. Just please, we don't need your help. Please, we
no. But you really need companies that want to change, because if you start concession bargaining with them, and they use Arcelor is really behaving, badly when it comes to their collaboration with unions and also with politicians. And they're really doing, blackmailing them to get more state aid for things they should be able to pay for.
Right. Great. Thanks so much, Alexander. I just want to note, anyone who's online, if you'd like to ask a question, please just put it into the chat and we'll try our best to sort of get to it. We have another panelist joining us this morning and this afternoon, Johan Rutsen from the Swedish Environmental Research Institute. His work looks at the steel value chain as well as other industrial global supply chains. And if anyone is not familiar, I think, with the Swedish Environmental Research Institute's work, I strongly recommend checking it out, as the range and depth of their climate and decarbonization research, I think, are unsurpassed, especially on a national level. And they cover all kinds of industries, whether it's steel, cement, hydrogen, and many more. And I'd just like to flag that Johan Rutsen and his colleagues have just published a new article in Energy Research and Social Science addressing whether green growth models are actually sufficient to meet the climate targets that we're looking at, or whether new social priorities, whether for care, reduced working hours, should take precedence. Johan, if you could just join us. I don't see you here, but I did see you here in the chat box there. What are your thoughts and questions about what you've heard today?
Yeah, thanks, John, for that introduction, and thanks to the panelists. It's been very interesting listening in. I'll jump right into the questions, I think. I attended another webinar focused on the steel industry transition in Europe earlier this week, and I think you can see a clear divide between how firms and unions position themselves in Sweden and possibly France and Spain and the rest of continental Europe. So maybe first question to you, Alexander. Do you also see this divide? And because I guess in continental Europe the conditions aren't as favorable for fossil-free steel production, and how to navigate that divide as unions.
I'm not sure that we are divided in what we want. I think everybody wants to go, fossil free. and keep the jobs. This is the key. Unfortunately, in some parts of Europe, this will be really hard without huge state subsidies at the moment because of the energy situation. And then you also have the fact that we are, again, lucky or good that we have companies that want to change and have a good business case. On the continent, this is not the case. If you look at CRIMT, they're still pushing a little bit for the transformation, but really saying we need more help. ArcelorMittal says there is no business case. Liberty, they've just gone bankrupt and nobody knows what will happen. And you have new sites. Then you have Salzgitter, which are pushing for the green transformation. Although when you talk to them, they say it's hard to get the business case to work at these prices. Hopefully the tariffs will work. First Alfin is also a case where you have the same DR. Then when you go down to the southern parts, in Spain, they should have a good case to go green because of the energy situation they will get with sun and so on. But again, those steel companies maybe aren't as willing to invest as our guys are because, again, on the price and what kind of products you make. So you really need that kind of political decisions to force them to, both with the carrot, with the state aid help, but also with the stick, that you need those kind of firm goals when it comes to emissions. If you don't have both, nothing will happen. And probably you'll see some companies making the choice not to invest. And this is really hard for a trade unionist because that will mean job losses. But there is no transition where you will go, everything will go smoothly, everybody will, be a winner and nobody will be a loser. That's industry overall. The problem we have right now as Swedes is that we are partly losing some of our comparative advantages, especially our cheap green energy. If Europe makes something else, or if you allow huge amounts of state aid, which we won't get in Sweden, then you tilt the board. So right now we're in a strange situation where you don't know where we are heading. But for a trade unionist, we want our members to be the winners. And we believe that this is the right way. We as a union say, if you can't pay Swedish wages, you shouldn't be in Sweden. Other unions don't have the same mindset. They will concession bargain. They will lower wages. They will do stuff to make this happen. We won't. And again, if you look at some of these companies, you've seen huge job losses over the years. So the situation for the unions on the continent is really hard. So hopefully the tariffs will help. But again, and many are afraid that they're not in a good situation right now. And these are towns, communities that could be really disrupted. They are already disrupted by the changes. If you go, I think Alistair can probably talk about the towns in northern England. We have them in Sweden as well that used to be like flourishing steel towns that are today really, places where you've lost half the population and nothing is happening. But we don't talk about it in Sweden. I don't know if that was an answer to your question, but it's really situation based, where you are, what kind of company it is, what the plant does, and also what the actual owners want to do with the plant. So there is no, one size fits all answer to the question.
Alistair and Meg, do you want to quickly chip in? If not, I'll ask you a tougher question. So we have a question from a South African representative. Let's say the global north does move forward on, carbon adjustment border mechanisms, and it does look to, protect domestic markets. I guess what's that going to mean for these global companies that have steel mills and coking plants and iron plants, elsewhere in the global south? Does that not then shut off the kinds of opportunities and some of those jobs, in those plants and and along those global supply chains, and if we were to think about it, what's the nature of union solidarity in that kind of case where you're trying to decarbonize your own markets and trying to protect jobs, but the worry is that this might come at the cost of jobs and or elsewhere, as well as in the cost of some of those supply chains, more broadly. What's the nature of international solidarity? How can that move forward here? I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
It's well, shall I kick off, mate? So, I mean, obviously, that's a very difficult one. It's certainly true that there are consequences to the likes of the UK and our European neighbours protecting borders. I would say that the target for that is mainly China. It's certainly not the global south. I mean, we see carbon pricing and protecting our borders, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, absolutely critical for us. I mean, we do if we're going to decarbonize, we have to protect our market from carbon intensive imports. I mean, done right, we see decarbonisation as massive opportunity for us in the same way as Alex does. Our experience has been different, but the opportunity is the same. We have a fantastically valuable market, and we're down now to a shocking 30% market share. We only make 30% of the steel that the UK consumes. And if we can get the policy framework right, and if we can protect our border from dumped, unfairly traded and carbon intensive imports, then we've got huge opportunities to grow our industry and create more jobs and replace some of those that are lost due to the decarbonisation transition. It has to be done right. We're very concerned that the UK's carbon border adjustment mechanism is coming in too late, a year after the EU's, and it's not really quite fit for purpose. It's not going to be as robust as the EU's. We're going to, for example, use it seems a sort of global average carbon sort of measurement for all imports, whereas the EU will use a China-specific measure, which is much more robust than the measures we're looking to adopt. So we have to get it right. It is an absolutely crucial part of the jigsaw. It's difficult to say this, I suppose, but of course, from a UK perspective, we've been losing thousands of jobs, and our industry's been hanging by a thread. So we are looking after our own interests as far as we can. So I know that's not a particularly sort of palatable answer in that respect, but we absolutely recognise the concerns that colleagues will have, particularly in the global south. But the challenge we've got is the fact that if China sneezes and their economy catches a cold and they export 5% of their capacity, then we're all going to die, aren't we? That's where we are. Yeah.
Right. Meg or Alexander, would you like to chip in?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what I would say is similar to Alistair. I mean, I think a carbon border adjustment. We don't have one in Canada. We've advocated for one for years. There's no the federal government has studied it multiple times. There's no commitment to do it, and so by the time anything, if it were to be implemented, it would definitely be very, very late. But it's something that we continue to advocate for, and I think global multinationals certainly take advantage of the fact that there are poor labor and environmental conditions in other parts of the world, and then that does sort of it undermines decarbonization efforts in the global north where they exist. And so, yeah, we're favorable towards that. And also, I mean, there's also the part of the pricing on carbon that's highly politicized in Canada. A price on carbon, the sort of industrial price on carbon, not as much, but it still is a problem. And certainly right-wing conservative politicians use that all the time to say that Canada's not competitive and this is this hurts jobs and things like that. So having some sort of way of evening things out is important politically as well. And certainly, if there's going to be any meaning to any of the decarbonization policies, we can't just have those be undercut by, high carbon steel from other parts of the world.
Alexander?
maybe just to add to that, we are probably one of the most pro-free trade unions in the world. Maybe the Danes are a little bit more pro-free trade. I mean, we are a net exporter of things. We celebrate mid-March every year the export day as a union, because at that point we stop making things for our domestic market and everything else goes on export. So we are extremely dependent on this. Unfortunately, the steel market in Europe is drenched in cheap imports from parts, especially Southeast Asia, but also other parts of the world, which is killing the market. So at the moment, there is no business case to invest or sell steel in Europe, even high-grade steels. We see that things are coming in at under cost. What is the price of the material in Sweden? Chinese companies and other companies selling the finished product for cheaper price. This isn't realistic. And if we want to keep this, we have to protect ourselves, because the US market is closed for us, the Chinese market is closed for us, and also the Indian. So the big markets are closed and Europe is open. We have tried to be, see to it not to have tariffs and things, but at the end of the day, it doesn't work anymore, especially if you want to go green. So that's why we are now for steel tariffs in Europe actively. We also think that the carbon border adjustment mechanism is needed. And of course, it's going to impact companies in the South. Unfortunately, our union friends. But this way of doing business isn't viable. So if we would have a totally free trade, a working free trade mechanism, I would be the first one to say take away the tariffs or the mechanism, but it isn't working at the moment, especially in steel. And we'll probably have to see it in sector after sector as things progress, especially after the way the US has acted in the last couple of years. I mean, China was bad before, and India, but the US has really changed the game totally right now.
Yeah, I think just following up on that, perhaps just one last question. So, how much does, tariffs and, a new regime now, a new national sort of strategies on tariffs, being implemented, and, the Trump administration, throwing tariffs on everyone, and then all other countries then having to respond in some ways. How much does that throw a wrench into what was, has become a global industry and a global enterprise? I guess that's a sort of a question. And at the same time, we also see this much greater, emphasis now on countries, around the world in terms of investing in defense as part of that. And of course, that's the steel industry as well. Does that change it for the better, or does it change it for the worse? Does it just make it more complicated once again, or does it actually provide something, as Alexandra has just hinted at, perhaps an opportunity for the steel industry on the issues of, say, national security, but perhaps better on, sustainability, as a way of protecting those jobs and making sure that those industries, survive as opposed to continually decline? Another
I
big,
can,
another big question.
yeah, I'll start things off. So in terms of, yeah, the Trump administration's policies and, sort of changing everything, I mean, I think it does. They certainly, we've all expressed in some manner the problem of global overcapacity and there just being too much steel in global markets. And so, and problems certainly for us in Canada and the US, we've had a lot of problems for our manufacturing sectors from the global free trade agreements, and Canada under the NAFTA and now the CUSMA. Increasing integration and reliance on exporting to the United States. I mean, some of that's just logic, considering that we're right next to each other, but we clearly became too over-dependent on that relationship. But sort of more generally, I mean, I think as a union, we've never been opposed to tariffs if needed as an economic tool. I mean, Trump is just going crazy with it, as we can see, and uses a political tool and is his favorite thing to impose tariffs here and there. So that certainly does disrupt things and throw a wrench into them. But it does, I think, in terms of the union's position on free trade and tariffs and so on, has allowed us some space to really kind of focus on issues of global overcapacity, kind of combined with this exposure of over-reliance on exports to the US in Canada, and sort of being able to build up our domestic industry and frankly advocate for some degree of tariffs on, global tariffs, and in particular aimed at that global overcapacity. And that's something that's not new for us. It's something that we've, way before Trump was ever in power. Those are types of things that we would have advocated for. And the shift to sort of a more focus on the a defense industrial strategy, those types of things. From a militarism point of view, maybe not great, but certainly for the domestic industry, there's some good things there. And I think in Canada, what we see is, even though there's this commitment to spend more and more on defense, and perhaps that's a necessity, in particular, we see these threats, territorial threats from our previously closest ally. So maybe some of that's a necessity, but also there's a pretty broad definition in terms of what is considered defense. And so there's opportunity there for major infrastructure investments and so on. And ultimately, a lot of good jobs can come from that as well. And so, our point is also to kind of tie all of that back together, again, as I've mentioned many times, with a sort of broader overarching industrial strategy that also includes climate and decarbonization goals. And so we're not just focused on defense or just, one thing piecemeal here or there. So I hope that kind of answers the question, but I'll throw it over to others.
Great. Thanks, Meg. Alistair?
Yeah, so we're also traditionally a free trade union. That's what we believe in, but we're also pragmatists and realists. And as we're here today, the age of free trade in steel is essentially dead for now. The US tariffs gave us massive problems. It's our second biggest export market. 10% of our steel exports go to the US, or did go to the US. We've got a slightly more favorable deal with the UK than other countries in terms of relief from US tariffs. But the bigger problem for us has been the trade diversion effects, and they've been massive for us. All the steel that was due to go into the US looking for a different home. The EU acted much more quickly and robustly than the UK, and so a lot of the steel has ended up in the UK and causes massive problems in terms of prices and sustainability of our UK companies. We've just a few weeks ago confirmed a new tariff and quotas regime in the UK. We're really pleased with it. It's similar to the EU's, but perhaps even stronger now in some areas. So we're now 50% tariff on steel outside of the quotas, and a 60% reduction to our steel quotas, which is huge for us and absolutely had to happen. It's crucial for the sustainability of the industry. So we're pleased with that. But what we would much favour in terms of a strategy is this idea of a steel club, which has often been talked about. The US, Europe, the UK, other responsible, as we would see it, actors who don't unfairly subsidize their steel industries and do things in the right way, coming together to form a group with a common external tariff and work together to tackle what is a shared challenge of global overcapacity and the really quite aggressive hostile trade actions of China. So that's where we prefer to focus our activities. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Alistair. And Alexander, 1 minute, sorry. If we, as a former free trade unionist, where are we at now? If something along the lines of Alistair talking about an EU club.
No, we would really like a EU club. Although I always make a joke when I talk to the Brits and say Brexit means Brexit. It's
it's Brexit plus, I believe. It's Brexit plus.
We would have, of course, we do a lot of business with the UK guys, and we would love to have that club also. But if you can have one in the free world, that would be great. But for us, I mean, I've talked about the green stuff, which is, we really believe that this is the future, and then you need protection. But also, I mean, when you talked about the military spending and defense, that is also a game changer. We look at because now we talk about resilience. We need this kind of sector in Europe, that we have this capacity to make our own steel and have the knowledge to do it, has really put it on the map in a different way. Because in Sweden, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, we can buy steel from everywhere. That would be the answer if you talk to politicians. Today, they don't say the same stuff, because we believe that we have to have national sovereignty of some crucial sectors. And this is an ongoing discussion in Sweden, which is only increasing, and also in Europe. So we're looking at lead markets to really promote some really crucial sector, like steel, for instance, but also rare earths. This is a completely new discussion in the recent years, which I find is good, because we've been sometimes too dependent on other countries and other parts of the world, where on which we can't trust anymore in the same way we did 5-10 years ago. So this is a game changer in one sense, I would say.
Great. Thanks so much, Alexander. And just to sort of bring the webinar to a close, I really want to thank Meg and Alistair and Alexander again for their insights and for the wide-ranging discussion, very insightful discussion that we've had today. I also want to thank our respondents, Dean and Johan, and everyone else who is attending today, as well as those who asked questions here online. I also want to offer my thanks and sincere gratitude to those working behind the scenes to pull the webinar off. That's always Nicholas Roby and Gansme, as well as Julie Hagen. And I just want to say it was a real pleasure to host this webinar, and a recording of the transcript will be made available shortly for everyone, for those who are interested. So just check back. And I'd like to say just take care, and I look forward to seeing you at our next CRIMT webinar session. Thank you very much, everyone.